Hey everyone, I'm Kevin,
And I'm Austin.
and today I'm going to be talking a bit on how and why we have the number of nuclear weapons we do.
Yeah, I was wondering, how exactly did we end up with all of those nukes? Before 1945, no one had any nuclear weapons, right?
Right.
So how did the world go from not having any nuclear weapons to having what? 15,000 in just 70 years?
Actually, at our peak in 1986, there were just about 64,000 nuclear weapons worldwide,
What?
but we'll get there in a minute. It all started with the Manhattan Project. Sound familiar?
Vaguely.
The Manhattan Project was the name of the American Research Initiative to manufacture the world's first nuclear weapon. The President of the United States at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, was the one to kick off the Manhattan Project. He did this after concerned emigrant physicists sent him a letter detailing the possibility of a German nuclear weapon.
But that didn't pan out, right? Because I don't recall ever hearing about a German nuclear bomb.
Right. So the Manhattan Project was established on the 13th of August in 1942 with the intention of developing a weapon that could be used against Nazi Germany in the Second World War. The project was carried out with the utmost secrecy. The 130,000 employees of the Manhattan Project underwent rigorous background checks, were only given information on a strict need-to-know basis, and had all of their incoming and outgoing mail censored.
Wow. But it all worked out in the end, because the Americans did create the first nuclear bomb.
Yep, the United States Army conducted the Trinity test, the first nuclear test, in New Mexico. This test took place on the 16th of July in 1945, more than a month after the Germans had capitulated to the Allies in Europe.
So the bomb was eventually used on Japan instead?
Right. Although the Manhattan Project was initiated as a perceived technological race against the Germans, by the time the Americans had completed the first bomb, Germany had already surrendered. However, with the enormous amount of time and money dedicated to the project, it was assumed that the bomb would have to be demonstrated, if only to justify the undisclosed diverting of wartime resources to Congress and the public. So, two bombs, a uranium bomb and a plutonium bomb, were detonated over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Which intimidated the Japanese into a surrender, leading to the end of the war.
Not necessarily. Some historians believe that it wasn't the destruction of cities that led the Japanese to surrender, as 66 other Japanese cities had already been bombed out by the Air Force, some of which had sustained even more damage than Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Oh wow.
Anyways, the fact remains that with the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan, the world was introduced to a new weapon capable of destroying cities in an instant.
That's pretty sobering. And to know that there are 15,000 of these weapons in the world is just a bit terrifying.
Actually, the nuclear weapons we have today are far more destructive than the ones used in Japan. The bomb deployed in Hiroshima, Little Boy, had a yield of 15 kilotons of TNT. To compare, the most powerful warhead in the US nuclear arsenal, the W-53, had a yield of 9 megatons of TNT, a full 450 times the yield of Little Boy. However, the last of the W-53s were dismantled in 2011. Now the B-83 is the largest bomb in service, with a comparatively small yield of 1.2 megatons, or 60 times the bomb used in Hiroshima.
That's crazy. What's that last one?
That's the blast radius of the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated. It was designed by the Soviet Union and tested in 1961 with a demonstrated yield of 57 megatons.
Seems like overkill.
Tell me about it.
Well, how did we end up making these weapons anyways? Going from 15 kilotons to 57 megatons in 15 years? That just seems ridiculous.
That jump was made possible by the development of the thermonuclear weapon, more commonly referred to as the hydrogen bomb. So, on the 29th of August in 1949, just 5 years after the first nuclear test in New Mexico, the Soviet Union detonated their first bomb.
That seems awfully soon.
If you think that took less time than expected, imagine how the Americans felt. Their earliest estimates put the Soviet Union crossing the nuclear threshold in 1953. The Soviets completed their bomb in a little over half the time that they were expected to.
And what does this have to do with the hydrogen bomb?
After the Americans realized that they didn't have a monopoly on the world's nuclear stockpile, a group of scientists, the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission, discussed the merits of developing a nuclear weapon even stronger than the ones that they already had.
And they agreed to do it?
No, the majority of the committee advised that the United States unilaterally reject the development of what they dubbed the superbomb. The remaining minority argued that the United States' commitment to refrain from building the bomb should be contingent on the Soviet Union's agreement to do the same. However, both groups were of the opinion that the United States should not be the first to develop the hydrogen bomb, due to the fact that such a weapon could not be directed solely at military targets. It would also result in countless civilian casualties. A weapon of that scale could only be used if civilian populations were also targets, a notion that the committee unanimously disapproved of.
But we ended up with the hydrogen bomb anyways, right? So the Soviet Union built the first thermonuclear weapons.
Nope. Although the GAC advised against it, the US government decided to go ahead with the project anyways. The first hydrogen bomb, codenamed Ivy Mike, was detonated in 1952 on the 1st of November. Ivy Mike had a yield of 10 megatons, or 500 times the yield of the bomb detonated over Hiroshima. The Soviet Union tested their first thermonuclear device shortly after, in August of 1953. American-Soviet relations were already strained before this, but afterwards tensions really rose. Both superpowers began manufacturing nuclear weapons by the thousands in an attempt to outproduce the other, to ensure that they had the upper hand. Tensions culminated during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the height of the Cold War.
That sounds familiar.
The Cuban Missile Crisis took place during President Kennedy's term in the October of 1962. It began when the Soviet head of state, Nikita Khrushchev, began housing nuclear missiles in Cuba as a response to the U.S. housing missiles in Turkey. After this was revealed to the U.S. government, a military blockade was established around Cuba to prevent the movement of more nuclear weapons. The following 13 days were the closest the U.S. has ever come to nuclear war.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, did tensions eventually die down?
Yes. Although the number of nuclear weapons worldwide fluctuated for the following decades, now there are not nearly as many of them as there were before. As a result of the implementation of a series of treaties and agreements, both nations have dismantled a large amount of their weapons, bringing the total number down to about 15,000 now.
That sounds like a huge step forward.
It was, but even the remaining 15,000 nuclear weapons are enough to render Earth inhabitable. But more on that later. I hope this brief rundown cleared up a few of the hows and whys you might have had about the world's nuclear stockpile. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again next video.